The structure of Judea, in the wake of the First Jewish-Roman War, was defined by its transition from a minor prefecture to a major imperial province governed by a legatus Augusti pro praetor of senatorial rank. This elevated status necessitated the permanent stationing of the Legio ex Fretensis within the ruins of Jerusalem, marking a fundamental shift from temporary military intervention to long-term occupation. By the early 2nd century, the province's boundaries encompassed the distinct topographical zones of the coastal plain, the central Judean highlands, and the Jordan Rift Valley, each maintaining divergent levels of Roman integration. Urban centers like Caesarea Maritima served as the primary conduits for Roman law and Mediterranean commerce, utilizing expansive harbor facilities to export local bitumen and balsam. In contrast, the rural interior remained dominated by a decentralized network of villages, where the social fabric was governed by the remaining priestly families and local elders who had survived the destruction of 70 AD. Demographic data from this period indicates a significant population shift toward the Galilee and the coastal regions, as the devastation of the previous century had thinned the inhabitants of the southern hill country. Despite these losses, the Judean population maintained a high degree of religious cohesion through the establishment of new intellectual centers at places like Yavne, where the Sanhedrin began the process of codifying oral traditions into what would eventually become the Mishnah. This internal reorganization occurred under the watchful eye of the Roman fiscus Iudaicus, a specialized tax bureau that redirected the former half-shekel temple tax to the treasury of Jupiter Capitolinus in Rome. This fiscal policy served as a persistent reminder of the loss of Judean sovereignty and the ongoing financial burden of the occupation. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? The provincial government prioritized the construction of a sophisticated road network, linking the administrative capital at Caesarea to the strategic hubs of Neapolis and Scythopolis. These paved routes allowed for the rapid movement of Roman auxiliary units and facilitated the collection of the annona, a grain tax used to supply the imperial legions. While the elites in the newly founded Roman colonies adopted the Latin language and Roman architectural styles, the majority of the indigenous population continued to speak Aramaic and practice ancestral rites. The legal status of the inhabitants was categorized under the Jus Gentium, or the Law of Nations, which allowed for a degree of local judicial autonomy provided it did not conflict with imperial interests. This period was characterized by a fragile equilibrium, where the physical presence of Roman fortifications and the systematic collection of taxes existed alongside a resilient Judean cultural identity that was actively reinventing itself in the absence of a central temple. The province functioned as a vital frontier zone, providing a buffer between the Mediterranean heartland and the Nabatean and Parthian influences to the east. The intensification of the Judean economy during the 2nd century was anchored in a sophisticated surplus-based agricultural model that moved beyond mere subsistence to supply the broader imperial markets. Primary to this output was the cultivation of the olive, where advanced beam presses and stone crushers were deployed to produce oil that served as a staple for lighting, hygiene, and nutrition across the Roman East. This oleaculture was supplemented by a robust viticulture, with specialized clay amphorae found at sites like Ashkelon, indicating the large-scale transport of Judean wine to the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The industry was supported by a unique tenant farming system, where small-scale producers worked parcels of land owned by the imperial fiscus or wealthy provincial magnates. Industrial-scale salt extraction along the periphery of the Dead Sea provided another vital pillar for the regional treasury, as this mineral was indispensable for the preservation of meats and the processing of hides. This environmental resource was managed through state-sanctioned monopolies that regulated the distribution of bitumen, highly valued for its waterproofing properties in Mediterranean shipbuilding and for its medicinal applications in Roman pharmacology. The local textile industry also flourished, utilizing flax grown in the fertile Jordan Valley to produce high-quality linen garments that were exported via the coastal hubs of Gaza and Joppa. Commercial activity was facilitated by a monetized economy, where local bronze pruta circulated alongside imperial silver denarii, providing the liquidity necessary for complex contractual agreements. These financial transactions often utilized the services of professional money changers who operated within the urban marketplaces, or macella, which were constructed following the Greco-Roman architectural canon. The province also benefited from its proximity to the Nabatean trade routes, serving as a terminal for the trans-Arabian spice trade that brought frankincense and myrrh from the southern peninsula toward the European provinces. Regional craft specialization is evidenced by the massive production of limestone vessels, which were favored by the local population due to specific purity regulations that exempted stone from the ritual defilement associated with ceramic wares. The distribution of these artifacts indicates a dense internal trade network that operated independently of the larger imperial supply chains. Simultaneously, the exploitation of local clay deposits fueled a prolific ceramic industry, producing the distinctive Judean lamps and utilitarian kitchenwares found in nearly every excavated second-century household. This economic framework was not merely local, but was intrinsically linked to the imperial annona system, whereby a percentage of all agricultural yield was requisitioned to maintain the professional Roman legions stationed along the eastern limes. This integration ensured that Judean productivity directly influenced the stability of the Roman military apparatus in the Levant, creating a symbiotic, albeit coercive, relationship between the provincial farmer and the imperial soldier. The transition into the reign of Trajan at the beginning of the 2nd century intensified the friction between the provincial administration of Judea and the distinct religious requirements of its indigenous population. This period was marked by the Kitos War, an expansive and violent uprising within the Judean diaspora that erupted in Cyrenaica, Egypt, and Cyprus around 115 AD, coinciding with Trajan's massive military campaign against the Parthian Empire. Although this conflict was primarily localized outside the Judean heartland, its brutal suppression and the resulting demographic devastation in the diaspora served as a catalyst for heightened Roman surveillance within the province itself. The Roman response included the deployment of additional auxiliary cohorts to secure the Via Nova Traiana, a vital logistical artery that connected the Red Sea to the Syrian frontier, passing through the newly annexed province of Arabia Petrea. This increased military presence necessitated the expropriation of local lands for the construction of permanent castra and watchtowers, directly disrupting traditional Judean inheritance patterns in agricultural tenure. Under Trajan, the Roman legal doctrine of religio licita provided a framework for the limited exercise of ancestral rights, yet the absence of a central temple continued to complicate the legal status of Judean religious leaders who lacked a formal venue for communal sacrifice. The imperial administration viewed any sign of messianic fervor with deep suspicion, equating religious devotion with political sedition and potential rebellion against the Pax Romana. This administrative skepticism was exacerbated by the Roman insistence on the imperial cult, where the offering of sacrifices for the well-being of the emperor was considered a fundamental civic obligation of all subjects. While Judeans were often granted exceptional exemptions from direct participation in pagan rituals, the daily visibility of Roman iconography and the presence of imperial statuary in civic spaces created a constant ideological friction. Economic grievances also worsened during this period as the provincial fiscus intensified the collection of the aurum coronarium, a voluntary gift of gold presented to the emperor on special occasions, which placed an additional burden on the already heavily taxed Judean peasantry. The Roman practice of munera, or the requisitioning of labor and resources for public works and military transport, further eroded the economic autonomy of rural villages. These administrative pressures were not merely fiscal, but were inextricably linked to the preservation of public order, as the Roman governor maintained a strict policy of coercio to suppress any perceived threats to imperial stability. The execution of high-ranking Judean figures, accused of revolutionary leanings during this era, reflects a hardening of Roman attitudes toward provincial dissent. Consequently, the period under Trajan functioned as a volatile precursor to the later Bar Kokhba revolt, characterized by a systematic accumulation of social, economic, and religious grievances that the Roman provincial apparatus was unable to reconcile through traditional diplomatic or administrative means. This era demonstrated that the fragile peace established after the 1st century was increasingly incompatible with the rigid demands of an expanding and centralized Roman imperial state. Publius Aelius Hadrianus ascended to the imperial throne in 117 AD, initiating a radical departure from the expansionist military doctrine of his predecessor. His administration was defined by the transition from territorial conquest to the consolidation of existing frontiers, symbolized by the abandonment of recently annexed Mesopotamian territories to stabilize the empire's eastern borders. Hadrian's governance was characterized by a unique peripatetic nature, as he spent more than half of his 21-year reign traveling through the provinces to personally oversee the standardization of imperial bureaucracy and the fortification of the limes. Central to his political philosophy was the concept of Pan-Hellenian, an institutional framework designed to elevate Athens as the cultural capital of a unified Greco-Roman world. This Philhellene orientation sought to establish a shared identity across the Mediterranean based on the aesthetics, philosophy, and civic structures of classical Greece. As a patron of the arts and a trained architect, the emperor personally designed monumental structures that utilized advanced concrete vaulting and dome construction, most notably the Pantheon in Rome, and his expansive villa at Tibur. His intellectual interests encompassed the Neo-Pythagorean and Epicurean schools of thought, which informed his pursuit of humanitas and his desire for a rational, orderly state. However, this commitment to Hellenism was not merely an aesthetic preference, but a deliberate administrative tool intended to replace local barbarian idiosyncrasies with a singular, superior cultural standard. To facilitate this, Hadrian authorized the reorganization of provincial cities into coloniae and municipia, which mandated the adoption of the Greek gymnasium and the Roman bath complex as essential features of urban life. His obsession with cultural uniformity extended to the codification of the Edictum Perpetuum, a definitive standardization of the Roman Praetorian edicts that removed local judicial variability in favor of a centralized legal system. This administrative streamlining was supported by the creation of the Advocati Fisci, a professional corps of state lawyers dedicated to protecting imperial financial interests. While Hadrian maintained the traditional title of Pontifex Maximus, his personal religious leanings were increasingly syncretic, favoring the mystery cults of Eleusis and the deification of his favorite, Antinous, which introduced a new, controversial layer to the imperial cult. This drive for a pan-imperial religious and cultural synthesis created an environment where indigenous practices that resisted Hellenization were categorized as primitive or subversive. The emperor's personality was described by contemporary biographers as various, multiplex, multiformis, frequently shifting between intellectual generosity and autocratic severity. He viewed himself as the supreme architect of a new world order, where the diversity of the provinces would be subsumed under the majestic umbrella of Greek culture and Roman law. In Judea, this vision manifested as a refusal to tolerate the perceived exclusivity of local tradition, leading to the appointment of governors who shared his uncompromising commitment to cultural integration. This imperial policy of forced homogeneity, though intended to ensure long-term stability, fundamentally ignored the resilience of non-Hellenic identities, setting the stage for a catastrophic collision between the universalist ambitions of the emperor and the specific religious requirements of the Judean people. Hadrian's arrival in the Levant during the summer of 130 AD represented a pivotal moment in the administration of the eastern frontier, as the emperor's presence transformed abstract policy into visible imperial command. This journey was part of a broader circuit that included significant stops in Syria and Arabia, where the provincial governor Tineius Rufus facilitated high-level meetings between the imperial entourage and local leadership. Unlike the purely military inspections of previous centuries, this tour was structured as a grand cultural visitation, emphasizing the emperor's role as the restorer of order and the supreme arbiter of provincial disputes. In Judea, this physical presence underscored the gravity of the upcoming urban reforms, as Hadrian personally reviewed the logistical capabilities of the regional road network and the positioning of the legions. The primary friction arose during formal audiences, where Judean delegates sought clarification on the restoration of their religious center, an issue that had remained in a state of unresolved expectation for decades. While earlier imperial communications may have contained ambiguous language regarding the reconstruction of Jerusalem, Hadrian's direct interactions signaled a categorical shift toward a Hellenistic redefinition of the site. The emperor's refusal to grant the indigenous population a temple dedicated to their monotheistic deity, proposing instead a site for the Roman Jupiter, fundamentally altered the diplomatic relationship between the provincial elite and the crown. This impasse was not merely a failure of communication, but a deliberate assertion of the Roman right of dispossession, as the emperor utilized the concept of territorium to claim the sacred topography for the Roman state. Fiscal and administrative protocols were also tightened during this visit, with the emperor authorizing a more rigorous auditing of provincial revenues and the implementation of stricter census procedures. These measures were designed to maximize the economic efficiency of the province to fund the massive construction projects planned for the new Roman colony. The visibility of the imperial retinue, including architects, surveyors, and specialized legal advisors, served as a tangible demonstration of the impending erasure of traditional Judean land tenure. Hadrian's personal involvement in the planning of the decumanus and cardo for the new city of Aelia Capitolina signaled to the local population that the transformation was no longer a theoretical administrative goal, but an imminent physical reality. Furthermore, the emperor's interactions with the neighboring Nabatean and Syrian communities during this tour reinforced a policy of regional containment as he sought to integrate Judea into a larger, stable Eastern bloc that prioritized Greco-Roman civic values. This strategic alignment marginalized the specific religious concerns of the Judean people, treating their ancestral requirements as secondary to the broader security and cultural coherence of the Levant. The conclusion of Hadrian's tour left the province in a state of profound psychological and political alienation, as the local leadership recognized that the imperial apparatus was no longer a distant taxing authority, but an active, nearby force committed to the total reconstruction of their ancestral world. This shift from neglect to intrusive reform provided the final ideological impetus for the radicalization of the Judean population. The formal establishment of Colonia Aelia Capitolina represented the definitive legislative instrument for the de-Judization of the region's historical capital. Issued as an imperial decree, this policy reclassified the ruins of Jerusalem as a Roman colony, a status that conferred specific legal privileges upon its future inhabitants, primarily retired veterans of the Legio Ex Fretensis and Romanized settlers from the wider Hellenistic East. The nomenclature was meticulously chosen to assert imperial ownership. Aelia honored the emperor's gens, the Aelii, while Capitolina dedicated the site to the Capitoline triad Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. This transition was sanctioned through the traditional Roman ritual of the sulcus primigenius, where a sacred furrow was plowed by a team of cattle to delineate the new pomerium, or the ritual boundary of the city. In Roman jurisprudence, this act effectively terminated the previous legal existence of the Judean city, replacing its religious and civil history with the rights and obligations of a Roman municipium. The urban plan adopted for Aelia Capitolina followed the rigid castramentation model used in military colonies, featuring an orthogonal grid of streets centered around two primary thoroughfares, the Cardo Maximus, running north to south, and the Decumanus, extending east to west. This design served as an instrument of spatial control, facilitating the rapid movement of garrisons and the systematic management of the urban population. At the intersection of these axes, the Roman surveyors established the Forum, the administrative and commercial heart of the colony, which featured a macellum and a basilica for judicial proceedings. To solidify the cultural transformation, the decree authorized the construction of a monumental tetrapylon at the city's main gates and a large theater for Roman spectacles. Most significant was the planned construction of the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus on the high ground of the former Temple Mount, an architectural imposition designed to signify the absolute victory of the Roman state over the indigenous deity. Additional pagan structures, including a sanctuary dedicated to Aphrodite and a Roman bath complex, were positioned over sites previously associated with Judean ancestral history. The decree also introduced the ius italicum, which exempted the colony's land from the traditional provincial taxes, thereby incentivizing the relocation of loyal Roman citizens to the area. Furthermore, the administrative status of the city was governed by a duo of duoviri, elected magistrates who reported directly to the provincial governor, ensuring that the municipal council, or curia, functioned as a loyal extension of imperial authority. The implementation of the decree necessitated the enforcement of strict exclusion zones, where the indigenous Judean population was legally barred from entering the pomerium under penalty of death. This territorial segregation was managed through the issuance of tesserae, or identification tokens, which regulated access to the newly built Roman markets and public spaces. By formalizing Aelia Capitolina as a Greco-Roman civic entity, the imperial administration aimed to create a permanent cultural barrier that would prevent the resurgence of local nationalist sentiment. The decree effectively transformed the sacred topography of Judea into a standardized Roman provincial landscape, where the architectural language and legal frameworks of the empire were utilized to suppress the unique identity of the Levant's traditional spiritual center. The tension between the Roman imperial administration and the Judean population reached a critical threshold through the implementation of legislation that targeted the fundamental biological and ritual markers of indigenous identity. Central to this friction was the imperial ban on circumcision, which Hadrian's legal advisors categorized not as a religious exemption, but under the broader criminal statutes of the Lex Cornelia de Sicarius et Veneficis. By reclassifying this ancestral rite as a form of castration or permanent bodily mutilation, the Roman state effectively moved the practice from the realm of private ritual into the sphere of capital offenses punishable by death or perpetual exile. This legal maneuver reflected a fundamental incompatibility between the Hellenistic ideal of the perfected human form, central to the gymnasium and bathhouse culture of the Panhellenian, and the Judean requirement for physical distinction as a sign of the covenant. Beyond the physical prohibitions, the Roman provincial apparatus under the governor Tineius Rufus began to strictly enforce the ius publicum to monitor communal gatherings and the teaching of local law. While earlier administrations had largely ignored the internal dynamics of village life, the Hadrianic era introduced the coercitio, the magisterial power to compel obedience to suppress the public reading of the Torah and the observance of the lunar calendar. These administrative intrusions were supported by a network of frumentarii, an imperial intelligence corps that tracked the movements of local scholars and influential families. The Roman insistence on the unitas of the empire meant that any legal or ritual system operating independently of the centralized Roman law was viewed as a potential collegium illicitum, or an unauthorized and subversive association. The friction extended to the symbolic economy of the province, as the imperial authorities introduced coins and monuments that featured overtly pagan iconography within previously sensitive districts. The presence of the Palladium and other Roman ritual symbols on local currency served as a constant legislative assertion of the supremacy of the Roman gods over the monotheistic traditions of the Levant. Furthermore, the provincial administration began to mandate the use of the formula in local judicial proceedings, requiring Judean litigants to utilize Roman legal terminology and procedural norms in disputes that were traditionally settled by local councils of elders. This systematic erosion of judicial autonomy meant that even mundane civil interactions were now subject to the scrutiny of Roman jurisprudentia. The Roman perspective viewed these measures as necessary steps toward the civilizing mission of the empire, aiming to eliminate superstitio, the excessive or irrational religious practice that disturbed the pax deorum, or the peace of the gods. To the imperial mind, the standardization of the body and the law was a prerequisite for full participation in the benefits of Roman citizenship. However, the enforcement of these laws created an existential crisis for the Judean population, as the state was no longer merely demanding taxes, but was actively legislate against the continuity of their spiritual and communal life. The resulting friction was not a peripheral dispute over tax rates or border disputes, but a direct collision between an all-encompassing imperial ideology and a community that regarded its ritual laws as immutable. This era of prohibition transformed the provincial administration into an active persecutorial force, establishing the legal and social conditions that made the subsequent total war of the Bar Kokhba rebellion nearly inevitable. The leadership of the revolt in the early 132nd AD was unified under the administrative and military authority of Simon Bar Kokhba, a figure whose historical presence is validated by primary documentary evidence recovered from the Judean desert. While his name was later popularized as Bar Kokhba, or Son of a Star, by religious supporters such as Rabbi Akiva to emphasize a messianic role, his official titles in contemporary papyri were Nasi Yisrael, signifying Prince or President of Israel. This designation moved beyond tribal or local chieftaincy to assert a formal sovereign executive status over the Judean people. His emergence coincided with the radicalization of the rural population, as he provided a singular command structure for the disparate anti-Roman groups that had been operating in the highlands. Bar Kokhba's authority was characterized by a rigorous, centralized bureaucracy, where he directly oversaw the distribution of resources, the leasing of state-owned lands, and the strict enforcement of religious observances among his military forces. The legal and logistical frameworks of his administration are detailed in the Bar Kokhba letters, which demonstrate an uncompromising and often stern command style. These documents reveal a leader preoccupied with the minutiae of provincial logistics, from the requisitioning of grain and pulse to the specific transport of the 4 species required for the festival of Sukkot, even in the midst of active combat. His governance functioned through a hierarchy of regional commanders and administrators based in hubs like En-Gedi and Herodium, who were held personally accountable for the execution of his directives. Bar Kokhba's administration also implemented a radical economic break from Rome by issuing a new currency. These coins were frequently overstruck on Roman denarii and tetradrachms, physically erasing the image of the emperor and replacing it with symbols of Judean ritual and statehood, such as the temple facade, trumpets, and palm branches. This monetary policy was not merely symbolic, but served as a tool for fiscal independence, as the new coinage was required for internal transactions and the payment of soldiers. Bar Kokhba's leadership also effectively co-opted the remains of the Judean priestly and scribal classes, utilizing their literacy and legal expertise to manage a complex system of land tenure that replaced the Roman imperial fiscus. Unlike previous uprisings, his movement was not characterized by internal factionalism. Instead, he enforced a singular military discipline that punished dissent and ensured a unified front against the legions. The geopolitical impact of his rise was felt across the eastern Mediterranean, as his successes emboldened local populations and required the Roman state to acknowledge the existence of a de facto Judean government operating within its borders. His reign as Nasi represented the last time in antiquity that a Judean executive exercised autonomous control over the territory, military, and economy of the southern Levant, establishing a state apparatus that for a brief window functioned in complete defiance of the Roman world order. The transition from administrative friction to open insurrection was underpinned by an unprecedented engineering program of subterranean hideouts and logistical preparation. Archaeological surveys across the Shepla and the Judean highlands have identified over 300 refuge complexes specifically designed to facilitate prolonged asymmetric warfare against the imperial legions. Unlike the ad hoc shelters used in the 1st century, these 2nd century systems were meticulously planned, often involving the deliberate modification of existing cisterns, cellars, and columbaria into interconnected networks. The hallmark of these preparations was the creation of narrow, winding tunnels, frequently no more than 60 centimeters wide, linking larger cavernous halls to inconspicuous exits. These crawlways were strategically engineered with right-angle turns and ventilation shafts to neutralize the Roman advantage in heavy infantry equipment and to prevent the effective use of smoke for flushing out occupants. These underground bunkers functioned as the hidden infrastructure of the Bar Kokhba state, serving as command centers, hospitals, and secure storage for the agricultural surpluses required to sustain a non-combatant population during the impending siege. The technical proficiency required to excavate these systems within the local limestone suggests a high degree of centralized coordination, likely overseen by military engineers who had studied Roman siege and mining techniques. Within these complexes, the rebels established clandestine armories. Forensic analysis of iron deposits and slag found in rural Judean caves confirms that the insurgents engaged in the large-scale refurbishing of captured Roman weaponry. Furthermore, historical accounts from Dio Cassius indicate that Judean smiths deliberately produced defective arms for Roman requisition orders, ensuring that the primary imperial supply chain was compromised, while the rebels retained high-quality redirected equipment. Food security was managed through the excavation of specialized storage pits lined with plaster to prevent moisture from spoiling grain, pulses, and dried fruit. The positioning of these caches followed the logistical requirements of a decentralized guerrilla force, allowing small war bands to operate independently of a vulnerable central supply line. Intelligence and communication were maintained through a relay system of signal fires and messengers who moved between the hidden entrances of the tunnel networks, which were often camouflaged by household domestic structures or inconspicuous agricultural features. This invisible landscape meant that while the surface appeared to be under Roman administrative control, the subterranean reality was one of total mobilization. The procurement of iron and wood for the manufacture of javelins, shields, and catapults was masked by the ongoing demands of the Roman construction projects at Aelia Capitolina, allowing the rebels to divert materials under the guise of legitimate civic labor. This period of preparation was characterized by a strict operational silence, as the Judean leadership successfully concealed the scale of their military readiness from the frumentarii and provincial spies. The resulting tactical advantage allowed for a simultaneous and coordinated strike that would catch the Roman provincial administration entirely off guard, demonstrating that the rebellion was not a spontaneous riot, but a systematically engineered campaign of national liberation. The transformation of the very bedrock of Judea into a defensive weapon ensured that when the conflict finally erupted, the Roman military would be forced to fight an enemy that occupied not just the hills, but the ground beneath their feet. The operational silence of the Judean highlands was terminated in 132 AD by a series of synchronized assaults that marked the formal commencement of the Bar Kokhba War. This insurrection utilized the previously established subterranean networks to bypass Roman surface patrols, allowing insurgent units to emerge behind the lines of the auxiliary cohorts stationed in rural outposts. The initial tactical success of the rebellion was predicated on the total neutralization of the local Roman intelligence apparatus. As the rebels targeted the beneficiary, specialized soldiers responsible for police duties and tax collection, thereby severing the provincial administration's communication with the interior. As Roman units moved to consolidate their defenses, they were subjected to lethal ambushes in the narrow defiles of the Judean mountains, where the heavy equipment of the legionaries proved a liability against the mobile, lightly armed Judean war bands. The primary strategic objective of the first phase was the isolation and recapture of the ruins of Jerusalem, where the construction of Aelia Capitolina was actively underway. Rebel forces successfully exploited the overextended positions of the Legio Exfratensis, forcing the legion to abandon the unfinished Roman civic project and retreat to its fortified castra. Contemporary numismatic evidence strongly suggests that Jerusalem was briefly re-established as the seat of the Bar Kokhba administration, with coins specifically dated to the first year of the redemption of Israel circulating within the city's vicinity. This reclamation of the spiritual center served as a massive ideological victory, effectively invalidating the Hadrianic decree of dispossession and restoring Judean control over the sacred topography for the first time in 62 years. Simultaneously, the insurrection expanded into the coastal plain and the northern districts of the province, prompting the rapid collapse of several minor Roman administrative centers. The scale of the uprising forced the provincial governor, Tineius Rufus, to request immediate reinforcements from the neighboring Legio VI Ferrata, stationed at Legio in the Galilee. However, even these combined forces proved insufficient to contain the rapid spread of the revolt, as the Judean rebels occupied a territory encompassing over 50 fortified villages and nearly 1,000 individual hideouts. The Roman military was forced into a defensive posture, ceding vast tracts of the Judean hill country to the control of the Bar Kokhba state. This initial success was consolidated through the establishment of a formal military border, utilizing the rugged terrain of the Beth Horon Ridge to block Roman counterattacks from the coastal capital at Caesarea. The insurgent navy also conducted limited operations from the port of Joppa, disrupting the maritime supply lines that the Roman military relied on for reinforcements from Egypt and Syria. By the end of 132 AD, the Roman provincial government had lost effective control over the heartland of the southern Levant, as the Judean forces under the command of Nasi Simon Bar Kokhba successfully transitioned from a clandestine resistance into a de facto national military capable of holding and defending significant territorial gains against professional legions of the Mediterranean world order. The administrative machinery of the insurgent state from 132 to 135 AD was structured around a rigorous bureaucratic framework that effectively supplanted the Roman provincial government across the southern Levant. Central to this system was the management of state lands, which were reclassified following the expropriation of imperial estates previously held by the Roman fiscus. Surviving documentary evidence, specifically the legal contracts found in the Judean desert, details the leasing of these lands to individual farmers in exchange for payments in kind, primarily grain and legumes, which were funneled into communal storehouses to support the military apparatus. These contracts were executed with precise legal terminology, often invoking the authority of the Prince of Israel to validate land tenure and ensure the systematic collection of agricultural dues. This fiscal centralization allowed the rebel government to bypass the traditional market economy, establishing a closed-loop system of resource allocation that sustained the insurgency despite the loss of coastal trade routes. The issuance of state coinage served as the most visible assertion of sovereign status, moving beyond symbolic defiance to create a standardized medium of exchange for the liberated territories. The metallurgical analysis of these coins reveals that they were produced by overstriking silver selenium and bronze prutat on pre-existing Roman, Nabatean, and Greek currency. The iconography featured on this coinage was meticulously curated to project a vision of restored Judean statehood, incorporating the architectural facade of the temple, the lulav, and the ethrog to replace the likeness of Hadrian and the symbols of the Roman legions. The inscriptions, written in the archaic Paleo-Hebrew script rather than the common square Aramaic or Greek, signaled a deliberate archasing effort intended to connect the 2nd century state with the historical Judean monarchy. This numismatic program effectively demonetized Roman currency within the rebel-held zones, compelling the population to participate in the financial life of the new administration. The executive authority of the state was maintained through a network of regional administrative centers, most notably at En-Gedi, which served as a primary logistical hub for the Dead Sea region. Correspondence from these centers reveals a highly structured chain of command where local administrators were tasked with a meticulous inventory of communal assets, including salt, bitumen, and vegetable oil. These officials were also responsible for the enforcement of the sabbatical year and other ritual laws, which were integrated into the civil code of the insurgent government to distinguish it from the secular Roman administration. The judiciary was reorganized to function under the guidance of local scribes and legal experts, who applied ancestral law to civil disputes, thereby removing the populace from the jurisdiction of Roman courts. This administrative sophistication extended to the management of labor, where the state requisitioned specific skills for the production of military equipment and the maintenance of subterranean infrastructure. By establishing these comprehensive systems of taxation, law, and currency, the administration demonstrated that the rebellion had evolved into a fully functioning state entity, capable of exercising domestic sovereignty and managing a complex wartime economy independently of the Roman imperial world. The Roman High Command's response to the insurrection was initially characterized by a catastrophic failure to comprehend the scale of the Judean mobilization. Early engagements resulted in the total disappearance of the Legio XXII Deotariana from the imperial military rolls. While no specific Roman chronicle details its final moments, Its absence from all subsequent garrison records suggests it was effectively annihilated during the first year of the conflict. This tactical disaster forced Hadrian to break with imperial protocol upon his return to Rome. When reporting to the Senate, he omitted the customary opening formula, "I and the legions are well," an unprecedented admission of severe military distress. The gravity of the situation was further signaled by the immediate recall of Sextus Julius Severus from Roman Britain, where he had been serving as governor and primary military commander of the northern frontier. This strategic relocation of the empire's most accomplished general across the breadth of the Roman world underscores the threat the Bar Kokhba state posed to the stability of the eastern provinces. The mobilization that followed involved the concentration of nearly one-third of the Roman Empire's total standing military strength. In addition to the resident 10th and 6th legions, the imperial administration diverted substantial detachments from the 3 Cyrenaica in Egypt and the 3 Gallica in Syria, alongside the IV Scythica. More significantly, entire vexellations were summoned from the distant Danubian and Rhine frontiers, including units from the Ex Gemina and the V Macedonica. This massive logistical undertaking required the utilization of the classis Syriaca and the classis Mycenaeus to ferry thousands of legionaries and specialized auxiliary cohorts across the Mediterranean. The Roman military apparatus also integrated specialized archers from Palmyra and heavy cavalry from the Arabian frontier to counter the guerrilla tactics of the Judean war bands. By 133 AD, the province of Judea contained a higher density of Roman military personnel than any other region of the empire. This concentration of force was managed through the establishment of temporary command hubs at Caesarea and Scythopolis, where imperial quartermasters organized the delivery of vast quantities of supplies to sustain 12 to 13 legions and their supporting units. The fiscal impact of this mobilization was profound, requiring the imperial treasury to redirect funds from civic architecture projects in Rome to pay for the salaries, bounties, and equipment of the mobilized troops. Hadrian's decision to personally oversee parts of the mobilization, eventually assuming the title of imperator for the second time despite the lack of a traditional territorial conquest, reflected the necessity of projecting imperial strength in the face of near-total provincial collapse. This buildup moved beyond standard police action to a full-scale war of reconquest, as the Roman state recognized that the existence of an independent Judean administration was a direct challenge to the territorial integrity of the Mediterranean world. The sheer scale of the Roman response serves as the most objective historical indicator of the rebellion's initial success and the profound shock it delivered to the Hadrianic world order. The Legio Ex Fretensis, originally raised by Octavian for the naval conflicts of the late Republic, served as the primary instrument of Roman military hegemony in the southern Levant, following the events of 70 AD. By the early 2nd century, the legion had established its permanent hiberna, or winter quarters, in the ruins of Jerusalem, where it operated as the administrative and coercive core of the province. The legionary symbol, the wild boar and the dolphin, marked the brick and tile production from the kiln works at Givat Ram, signaling the unit's deep integration into the regional infrastructure and economy. This military presence was not limited to the capital. The legion managed a vast logistical network of stadio small police posts and customs stations that monitored the flow of goods and people along the primary Roman arteries. These hubs were strategically positioned to oversee the collection of the tributum soli, or land tax, and to ensure the security of the imperial post, the cursus publicus. The outbreak of the Bar Kokhba insurrection targeted the systemic vulnerabilities of this overextended military machine. Rebel war bands prioritized the systematic destruction of the legion's logistical nodes, specifically the Presidia fortified outposts that secured water sources and grain depots. By isolating these individual detachments from the main body of the Fretensis, the insurgents successfully dismantled the Roman ability to coordinate rapid tactical responses. Archaeological evidence from rural Castra reveals that many of these outposts were overwhelmed in the opening weeks of the conflict, with Roman military equipment and standard-issue weaponry being redirected for use by the Judean forces. This seizure of military assets turned the Roman logistical strength into an insurgent advantage, as the rebels utilized captured engineering tools to further enhance their own subterranean defenses. Furthermore, the 10th Legion's dependence on auxiliary cohorts recruited from non-citizen populations across the eastern provinces created a significant point of failure when several of these units were either routed or neutralized early in the fighting. The Roman military machine relied on the Annona Militaris, a complex supply chain of grain and livestock that was easily disrupted by the scorched earth tactics and ambushes of the Judean rebels in the broken terrain of the highlands. The loss of these supply lines forced the Fretenses into a static defensive posture within Jerusalem and other major fortified centers like Caesarea and Bet Guvrin. The legion's inability to project power into the rural interior demonstrated the limitations of conventional heavy infantry when faced with an invisible, decentralized enemy. This strategic paralysis necessitated the massive imperial mobilization of external legions, as the resident military apparatus was insufficient to suppress the national uprising. The targeted dismantling of the Legio X Fretensis' provincial hubs remains a definitive historical example of how a specialized insurgent strategy can exploit the logistical rigidities of an imperial standing army. The appointment of Sextus Julius Severus to the Judean command in 134 AD marked the transition from reactive imperial defense to a systematic campaign of total liquidation. Severus, characterized by contemporary historian Cassio Dio as Hadrian's most preeminent general, brought a strategic doctrine refined by years of suppressing insurrections on the rugged northern fringes of the empire. Recognizing that the Judean insurgents utilized a decentralized network of nearly 1,000 individual subterranean strongholds, Severus eschewed the traditional Roman preference for decisive, large-scale field engagements, which had previously resulted in heavy legionary losses. Instead, he implemented a granular policy of compartmentalization, utilizing his massive numerical superiority to divide the province into isolated operational sectors. By deploying small, highly mobile detachments of legionaries and specialized auxiliaries, Severus initiated a relentless war of exhaustion that targeted the rebellion's biological and logistical viability. This strategy functioned through the methodical encirclement of individual Judean villages and hidden cavern complexes, preventing the movement of supplies and the communication between rebel warbands. The Roman military machine under Severus focused on the systematic interception of food convoys, the destruction of local cisterns, and the seizure of grain storehouses, effectively using starvation as a primary tactical instrument. This approach necessitated the construction of an extensive network of temporary fortifications and blockade lines that physically fragmented the Judean highlands, stripping the Nasi Simon Bar Koseba of his ability to maneuver his forces effectively. Severus's command was also defined by a refusal to offer terms or accept the traditional protocols of limited warfare. Every identified hideout was subjected to a methodical siege, where the narrowness of the tunnels prevented direct Roman entry. The military utilized specialized engineering teams to smoke out the occupants or collapse the limestone ceilings over the subterranean bunkers. This campaign of attrition was characterized by its extreme duration and lack of operational pause, maintaining constant pressure that prevented the Judean rebels from regrouping or replenishing their clandestine armories. The fiscal resources of the empire were fully committed to this prolonged endeavor, as Severus prioritized the preservation of Roman manpower by choosing time-consuming blockades over high-risk direct assaults. Under this new strategic paradigm, the Judean forces were gradually compressed into a shrinking perimeter in the southern hills. The efficacy of Severus's doctrine is reflected in the archaeological record, which shows a chronological progression of destruction layers moving from the periphery toward the final insurgent centers. By 135 AD, the Roman military had successfully neutralized the majority of the decentralized hideout networks, forcing the remnants of the Judean administration to retreat to their final mountain strongholds. Severus's arrival did not merely bring more soldiers. It brought a fundamental shift in the geometry of the conflict, transforming a war for territorial control into a methodical operation of demographic and political erasure. that the Bar Kokhba state was unable to counter through conventional or asymmetric means. This era demonstrated the capacity of the Roman military machine to adapt its engineering and logistical prowess to the specific challenges of a subterranean and decentralized resistance. The tactical heart of the confrontation shifted to the karst topography of the Judean wilderness, where the geological reality of the region dictated the pace of military engagement. The Roman command utilized its vast engineering corps to conduct a systematic survey of the limestone ridges, identifying the specific apertures that served as the primary ventilation and entry points for the insurgent hideouts. Unlike the siege of Masada in the previous century, which involved a single massive ramp, this second-century campaign necessitated the simultaneous management of hundreds of localized blockades across the broken terrain. Roman soldiers, often working in specialized cunae or wedges, established fortified camps directly atop the cave systems to monitor all surface movement, effectively turning the rugged hilltops into an imperial surveillance network. The Judean warbands exploited the verticality of the landscape, utilizing high-altitude vantage points to coordinate signal relays between isolated peaks, allowing for the rapid convergence of mobile units onto overextended Roman detachments. This asymmetric approach forced the legions to adopt the testudo formation not against traditional arrows, but against heavy boulders and projectiles launched from the heights. To counter this, the Roman military deployed specialized Cretan archers and Balearic slingers, whose high-angle fire was more effective than the standard legionary javelin in the craggy ravines. The engineering units also utilized portable ballistae and small torsion catapults, which could be disassembled and carried into the upland terrain to provide artillery support against fortified cave entrances. The struggle for the caves became a war of sensory and environmental deprivation. Roman doctrine evolved to include the diversion of mountain springs and the systematic poisoning of cisterns to force the occupants to emerge. When direct entry was attempted, the legionaries utilized the dolabra, a versatile pickaxe, to widen narrow passages or to breach the subterranean chambers from above. Inside the caves, the lack of light and the confined space neutralized the Roman advantage in formation fighting, forcing a transition to brutal close-quarters combat with the pugio and short sword. Archaeological remnants from these sites, such as the Cave of Horror, indicate that many Judean units chose to remain within the depths until the air or water was exhausted, leading to high rates of non-combatant mortality within the subterranean refuge systems. Logistical dominance was maintained by the Roman construction of the Viae Militares, paved supply roads that bypassed the narrow valley floors prone to Judean ambushes. These elevated routes ensured a constant flow of iron, timber, and grain from the coastal depots to the front lines in the hills. The Judean insurgency countered by utilizing the tesserae, the intricate knowledge of goat paths and seasonal riverbeds, to conduct nocturnal raids on Roman livestock and pack animals. However, the relentless Roman presence atop every significant height eventually created a perimeter that the rebels could not breach. This period of the conflict was defined by the attrition of the Judean middle management, as the provincial leadership was systematically hunted through the canyons. By the final year of the war, the insurgent territory was reduced to a series of disconnected island strongholds as the Roman military machine successfully utilized its engineering prowess to colonize the very peaks and depths of the Judean heartland. The Roman strategy for final victory in the Bar Kokhba War shifted from traditional combat to the systematic eradication of the province's biological and logistical foundations through a formalized scorched earth policy. This operational phase was governed by the Vestatio, a military protocol that mandated the total destruction of an enemy's productive capacity to ensure they could no longer sustain a state apparatus or military force. Roman legionaries, organized into labor battalions, were tasked with the methodical dismantling of the rural infrastructure that had supported the insurgent state for over 3 years. According to the historical accounts of Cassius Dio, the Roman military successfully razed 50 of the rebels' most significant fortified outposts and destroyed 985 of their best-known villages. This was not a byproduct of combat, but a premeditated administrative act of territorial sterilization designed to deprive the remaining Judean warbands of their recruitment pools and food supplies. The execution of the Vestatio focused specifically on the agricultural technology of the Judean highlands, which was essential for the survival of the dense upland population. Roman units systematically uprooted olive groves and vineyards, which required decades of labor to reach maturity, ensuring that the economic recovery of the region would be impossible for generations. Engineering teams were deployed to demolish the intricate stone terraces that prevented soil erosion on the steep hillsides, effectively triggering the ecological collapse of the agricultural landscape. Furthermore, the legions targeted the grain processing infrastructure by destroying threshing floors and grinding stones, while simultaneously filling communal cisterns with debris and animal carcasses to permanently contaminate the local water supply. This environmental warfare was intended to create an uninhabitable zone, forcing the insurgent population into the open or into a state of total starvation. Logistical hubs that had served the Bar Kokhba administration were subjected to the deletio, the complete erasure of physical structures to prevent their reuse. Buildings were not merely burned, but were systematically disassembled, with the limestone blocks often repurposed for Roman military roads or fortifications. The Roman fiscus also coordinated the seizure of all surviving livestock, directing cattle and sheep to the imperial supply depots at Caesarea and Scythopolis to feed the mobilized legions. This mass expropriation of mobile wealth effectively liquidated the financial assets of the Judean peasantry. By the summer of 135 AD, the central Judean heartland had been transformed into a desolate landscape where the physical traces of human habitation were deliberately obscured. This campaign of destruction ensured that the Bar Kokhba state lost the territorial and economic depth required to maintain its independence, as the Roman military machine successfully utilized its manpower to colonize the landscape with ruins rather than settlements. By the summer of 135 AD, the remnants of the Judean administrative and military leadership were concentrated within the mountain fortress of Betar, located on a strategic ridge southwest of Jerusalem. This site, fortified with a massive perimeter wall and a series of square towers, served as the final operational hub for Simon Bar Kokhba. The Roman High Command, under the direct supervision of Julius Severus, responded by constructing a comprehensive circumvallation, a continuous siege wall extending over 4,000 meters around the entire base of the mountain. Archaeological surveys have identified the remains of this blockade, which included a series of Roman camps, or castra, positioned at regular intervals to ensure a total land embargo. This engineering feat physically isolated the fortress from its remaining support networks in the Shepela, making the replenishment of supplies impossible. The Roman military utilized specialized siege equipment, including heavy torsion catapults and onagers, to maintain a constant bombardment of the Judean defenses. Excavations at the site have uncovered numerous Roman ballista stones and arrowheads, testifying to the intensity of the missile fire directed at the ramparts. Inside the fortress, the defenders faced a catastrophic depletion of water and food resources, as the Roman blockade successfully intercepted all attempts to bypass the lines. Historical records from the period indicate that the siege lasted for several months, during which the Judean command structure was systematically decimated by hunger and disease before the final assault. The breakthrough occurred when Roman engineering units identified a structural weakness in the southern fortifications, allowing for a concentrated assault by the heavy infantry of the Legio X Fretensis and Legio V Macedonica. The final engagement within the walls of Betar resulted in the total annihilation of the insurgent garrison and the death of Simon Bar Kokhba himself. According to the accounts of Eusebius, the massacre that followed the breach was so complete that the Roman military suffered significant casualties of its own, necessitating a hard-fought room-to-room liquidation of the resistance. The fall of Betar was not merely a military defeat, but represented the formal termination of the Judean state apparatus. Following the capture of the fortress, the Roman provincial authorities implemented a policy of damnatio memoriae regarding the rebel leadership, while the surviving combatants were processed for enslavement or execution. The physical structures of Betar were systematically razed to prevent the site from becoming a future rallying point for Judean nationalism. This climactic event signaled the end of the 3-year War of Independence, as the Roman state achieved its objective of eliminating the Judean executive and military command. The conclusion of the siege left the province without a unified indigenous leadership, allowing the Hadrianic administration to proceed with the total political and demographic reorganization of the region. The fall of this last mountain stronghold effectively closed the ancient chapter of Judean territorial sovereignty in the southern Levant. The collapse of the Judean political entity was finalized with the systematic liquidation of the remaining insurgent pockets following the breach of the primary defenses at Betar. This terminal phase of the conflict was characterized by the Roman military's transition from siege warfare to a wide-area police action intended to eliminate the last vestiges of the Nazis' administrative staff. The death of Simon Bar Kasaba, confirmed by the cessation of his executive correspondence, and the abrupt end to the minting of rebel coinage, left the resistance without a centralizing authority or a recognized successor. Roman records indicate that his remains were handled in accordance with the protocols for high-status insurgents, ensuring that no physical site could serve as a focal point for future veneration. With the executive head removed, the cohesive command structure that had managed logistics, land leases, and military discipline for 3 years underwent an immediate and irreversible fragmentation. The final operational theater shifted to the Judean desert, where the last organized combat units sought refuge in the inaccessible cliffside complexes of Nahal Hever and Nahal Se'ilim. Unlike the earlier phases of the war, where these hideouts served as forward bases, they now functioned as terminal points of resistance. The Roman Legio Exfertensis established permanent siege camps on the plateaus directly above these caves, employing a strategy of total containment that relied on the absolute control of the vertical landscape. Archaeological evidence from the Cave of Letters reveals that the last bureaucrats of the Bar Kokhba state were trapped with their administrative archives, including land deeds and military orders, signifying the end of their ability to exercise civil governance. The Roman military did not engage in direct cave entry, but maintained the blockade until the biological viability of the occupants was exhausted, a process verified by the discovery of thousands of intact domestic artifacts alongside the remains of those who had sought sanctuary. The legal termination of the Judean state was signaled by the Roman seizure of the state seal and the systematic demonetization of the rebel Salaim. All internal contracts and property titles issued under the authority of the Nasi were declared nullius iuris, or legally void, under Roman law, effectively stripping the surviving population of any claim to the land they had cultivated during the independence period. The Roman provincial authorities implemented a census of the survivors, categorizing them as deditici individuals who had surrendered unconditionally and possessed no political rights within the empire. This status facilitated the mass deportation of thousands of captives to the slave markets of Gaza and Hebron, where the sudden influx of Judean prisoners reportedly caused the price of a human being to drop to that of a horse's ration. The fall of the last stronghold also marked the end of the Judean military's capacity to field organized units, as the specialized weapon smithies and hidden armories were systematically uncovered and destroyed. The Roman victory was so absolute that it allowed the emperor to accept the title of Imperator II in late 135 AD, a distinction specifically reserved for the total suppression of a major threat to imperial integrity. The political entity that had briefly issued its own laws and currency was replaced by a rigid military administration, marking the transition from a contested province to a pacified territory. This total collapse was not merely a military defeat, but a comprehensive administrative erasure, ensuring that the short-lived Judean state left behind no functioning institutions or governing elite to challenge the subsequent Roman reorganization of the Levant. The conclusion of the Bar Kokhba War was codified through a definitive imperial edict that established a permanent exclusion zone around the ruins of Jerusalem. This decree transformed the temporary military prohibitions of the war years into a standing provincial law, specifically targeting the ethnic and religious core of the Judean population. Under the terms of the mandate, any person of Judean descent was strictly prohibited from entering the territory of Aelia Capitolina, with the exception of a single day each year, the 9th of the month of Av, on which they were permitted to enter for the purpose of ritual mourning. This exclusion was enforced by the permanent stationing of Roman detachments at every major gateway and access route leading into the city, where soldiers were tasked with verifying the identity of travelers. The legal boundary of this zone was defined by a radius that extended several miles from the city center, effectively creating a demographic vacuum in the traditional heartland of the southern Levant. This legislative act was supported by the physical implementation of the pomerium, the sacred and legal boundary of a Roman colony, which by definition excluded non-citizens and those deemed hostile to the Roman state. The decree also mandated the systematic confiscation of all Judean-held lands within this exclusion zone, which were subsequently reclassified as ager publicus, or state property. These lands were redistributed to Roman veterans and settlers brought in from other parts of the empire, particularly from Syria and the Hellenized provinces of Asia Minor. This forced redistribution was intended to ensure that the indigenous population lost the material basis for any future return to the region. To facilitate this transformation, the Roman administration utilized a specialized corps of surveyors, the agrimensors, to redraw the boundaries of the countryside, replacing traditional village markers with Roman centuriation grids. The decree of 135 AD also established a new judicial framework for the province, where the very act of unauthorized presence within the vicinity of Jerusalem was categorized as a capital crime. Roman legal scholars of the period, such as Ulpian, later referenced the special status of the province as a region where traditional ius gentium was suspended in favor of direct military oversight. This legal environment encouraged the permanent relocation of the surviving Judean population to the Galilee and the coastal plains, regions that remained outside the immediate exclusion zone. The imperial government also prohibited the appointment of any Judean to the municipal councils of the newly founded Roman cities, ensuring that political power remained entirely in the hands of the pagan and Hellenized elites. Furthermore, the edict served as an official declaration of the termination of the Judean province as a distinct political entity. By barring the population from their central cultic site, the Roman state aimed to break the link between the people and the land that had sustained their national identity. The enforcement of the expulsion was not merely a punitive measure for the rebellion, but a strategic effort to integrate the southern Levant into the broader Roman Mediterranean through a policy of total demographic substitution. This legislative erasure provided the legal foundation for the long-term transformation of the territory, marking the transition from a land defined by its indigenous traditions to one governed by the rigid administrative and cultural structures of the Roman Empire. The decree remained in effect for centuries, fundamentally altering the social and religious geography of the region. The physical reconstruction of Jerusalem into the colony of Aelia Capitolina was an exercise in imperial architectural imposition, designed to overwrite the city's indigenous Judean topography with a standardized Roman urban template. This transformation was anchored by the creation of the Quadra, a monumental rectangular precinct that reorganized the area formerly occupied by the Judean temple. At the center of this new civic religious heart stood the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, constructed according to the hexastyle or octastyle peripteral model common in the Roman West. This structure featured a high podium and a deep pronaos, housing the colossal statuary of the Capitoline Triad. Archaeological evidence, including recycled Herodian masonry found in the foundations of later Roman structures, indicates that the imperial engineers utilized the existing platform of the Temple Mount, effectively repurposing the most sacred site of the Levant to serve the state cult of Rome. The urban infrastructure was further defined by the completion of two massive fora. The Eastern Forum, located near the current site of the Muristan, served as the primary commercial hub, featuring a basilica for administrative and judicial functions. To the north, a second forum was established near the present-day Damascus Gate, marked by a triumphal triple-arched gateway that served as the formal entrance to the colony. This gate featured inscriptions dedicated to Hadrian and his successors, reinforcing the city's new identity as an alien foundation. The Cardo Maximus, the city's primary north-south artery, was widened and flanked by covered colonnades with Corinthian capitals, providing a shaded walkway for the Roman citizens and military personnel. Beneath these streets, a sophisticated network of vaulted sewers and lead piping was installed, connecting the city to the newly expanded aqueduct system that drew water from the springs of Solomon's pools. Civic life was further redirected through the construction of a large theater and a Roman bath complex, likely located in the southern portion of the city to serve the garrison of the 10th Legion. A sanctuary dedicated to the goddess Aphrodite was erected over the site of earlier Judean tombs, a deliberate architectural choice that utilized pagan sacred space to physically block access to indigenous ancestral sites. The city's gates were adorned with Roman military insignia and sculptures of the imperial family, while the coins minted within the city depicted the founder's plow ritual, legally confirming the site as a Roman colonia. This new urban fabric was devoid of any traditional Judean artistic motifs, favoring instead the marble reliefs and mosaic patterns of the Hellenistic Mediterranean. The administrative status of the city was governed by the Ordo Decurianum, a municipal council composed of loyal settlers who enforced the city's Roman laws and managed its public festivals. By 138 AD, the physical metamorphosis of the city was complete. The former Judean capital had been effectively replaced by a mid-sized Roman provincial center, where the visual language of stone and bronze served as a permanent reminder of imperial hegemony and the total displacement of the city's previous spiritual and political history. The administrative reorganization of the southern Levant reached its legislative climax in late 135 AD with the official abolition of the province of Judea. By imperial decree, the territory was integrated into a larger administrative unit rebranded as Syria Palestina. This nomenclature was not a random geographic assignment, but a calculated act of abolitio nominis, the erasure of a name, from official state records. By reviving the term Palestina, a Greek derivative of the ancient Philistines who had been the historical adversaries of the Iron Age Judean kingdoms, the Hadrianic administration sought to neutralize the ethno-religious claim to the land. This shift ensured that all future imperial documents, tax rolls, and military diplomas would no longer acknowledge the existence of a distinct Judean political or territorial entity. This renaming was accompanied by a fundamental change in the province's military status. Syria Palestina was elevated to a consular province, requiring the permanent stationing of 2 full legions, the Legio X Fretensis and the Legio Sixth Ferrata, to prevent the resurgence of indigenous resistance. This heavy militarization transformed the region from a civilian-led prefecture into a high-security frontier zone governed by a legate of the highest senatorial rank. The Roman central government also reorganized the provincial borders, incorporating parts of the former Tetrarchy of Ituraea and the Decapolis to further dilute the demographic concentration of the surviving Judean population. Administratively, the province was now tethered more closely to the governor in Antioch, shifting the center of gravity away from local Levantine concerns toward the broader strategic interests of the Roman East. The fiscal implications of this transition were equally transformative. The fiscus Iudaicus, once a specific penalty tax for a defeated nation, was increasingly absorbed into the general provincial census under the new territorial heading. Property titles were reissued using the revised provincial name, effectively delegitimizing any surviving deeds that referenced the older Judean district. This bureaucratic severance intended to produce a psychological year zero for the region, where the history of the land was to begin anew under the auspices of Roman Hellenism. Statues of Hadrian were erected in the civic centers of the renamed province, and the imperial cult was institutionalized as the primary unifying framework for the diverse groups of veterans and settlers now inhabiting the territory. In legal and scholarly circles of the 2nd century, such as those of the geographer Ptolemy, the new name was adopted immediately, illustrating how rapidly the Roman state could implement a change in the global cartographic record. The renaming of the province thus served as the final structural seal on the war's outcome, moving beyond the physical destruction of the rebellion to the conceptual dismantling of the Judean homeland. By the death of Hadrian in 138 AD, the map of the Roman Empire no longer contained a place called Judea, replaced instead by a standardized imperial province whose very name served as a testament to the state's power to redefine the identity of its conquered territories. The demographic displacement following the formalization of the expulsion edict in 135 AD triggered a massive internal migration that permanently shifted the center of the Judean population toward the northern districts and coastal fringe. As the exclusion zone around Aelia Capitolina was strictly enforced by Roman patrols, the displaced rural families from the Judean highlands sought sanctuary in the Galilee, which had remained relatively peripheral to the main theater of the Bar Kokhba conflict. This influx led to the rapid expansion of settlements such as Sepphoris and Tiberias, which transitioned from Greco-Roman administrative hubs into the primary residential and intellectual centers for the surviving elite. The Roman administration permitted this resettlement as a means of maintaining provincial agricultural productivity, while ensuring the population was physically removed from the sensitive religious topography of the south. Simultaneously, a significant portion of the displaced population moved toward the coastal plains, integrating into the existing urban centers of Lydda and Jamnia. In these environments, the refugees had to navigate a complex legal landscape where their status as Didyticii, those who had surrendered unconditionally, limited their ability to own land or hold civic office. Many were forced into tenant farming or urban labor, contributing to a shift from the landed peasantry model of the highlands to a more mobile, artisan-based economy. For those who could not find safety within the province of Syria Palestina, the only recourse was the established diaspora communities of the eastern Mediterranean. Large-scale emigration flowed toward the Jewish quarters of Alexandria in Egypt and Antioch in Syria, where the legal protections afforded to long-standing residents provided a buffer against the immediate post-war persecutions. The refugee movement was also characterized by the flight of the surviving intellectual class, which sought to preserve the legal and religious traditions of the people in the absence of a territorial center. These scholars established new academies in the Galilee, such as at Usha and Shepharam, where they began the transition from a temple-centric religion to one based on the study of the law and communal prayer. This transition was facilitated by the transfer of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Judicial Council, to the north, a move that provided a sense of continuity and administrative order for the scattered families. However, the immediate aftermath of the flight was marked by extreme economic precarity, as the loss of ancestral property in Judea meant that thousands arrived in their new homes without capital or resources. The Roman authorities monitored these migrations through the implementation of a revised provincial census, ensuring that the movement of people did not lead to new concentrations of military-aged men. The fiscus Iudaicus continued to be collected from these refugees in their new locations, serving as a persistent financial burden that hindered their economic recovery. Despite the trauma of the expulsion, the resilience of the refugee networks ensured that the Judean identity did not dissolve into the broader Syrian or Roman populations. Instead, the concentration of the survivors in the Galilee and the diaspora created a new demographic reality where the survival of the culture was no longer dependent on the possession of Jerusalem, but on the strength of its decentralized communal and intellectual institutions. This period of flight and resettlement laid the foundation for the rabbinic era, as the survivors adapted their ancient traditions to the realities of permanent displacement. The systematic dismantling of the Judean intellectual infrastructure followed the military conclusion of the Bar Kokhba revolt, as the Roman administration identified the scholar class as the ideological engine of the resistance. The Hadrianic persecution specifically targeted the transmission of the oral law, transforming the act of rabbinic ordination, or smicha, into a capital offense. This legal campaign aimed to create a generational fracture by executing the senior jurists who held the authority to appoint successors, thereby threatening the continuity of the Judean legal system. The most prominent victims of this era are recorded in historical tradition as the 10 Martyrs, a group of high-ranking sages whose executions were carried out through various methods of Roman capital punishment, including the cruciatus and burning at the stake. Among them was Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion, who was executed for the public teaching of the Torah, an act classified by the provincial authorities as a direct violation of the imperial edicts against unauthorized assembly and sedition. The loss of these figures represented the erasure of the Sanhedrin's executive corps, which had previously provided the religious and civil adjudication for the province. The execution of Rabbi Akiva, perhaps the most influential intellectual supporter of the Bar Kokhba administration, signaled the end of the alliance between the Judean academies and the nationalist military movement. Roman intelligence focused on the city of Lydda and other remaining centers of learning, forcing the surviving scholars into a clandestine existence. To ensure the survival of the legal tradition, Rabbi Judah ben Bava performed a final act of mass ordination in a secluded valley between Usha and Shepharim, an act for which he was subsequently executed by Roman light infantry. This strategic sacrifice allowed 5 of his students to escape to the Galilee, effectively preserving the chain of transmission that would later produce the Mishnah. The Roman authorities also implemented a ban on the public observation of the Sabbath and the celebration of the new moon, which were essential for the synchronization of the Judean liturgical calendar. By disrupting the ability of the sages to calculate the months, the state sought to fragment the community into isolated, uncoordinated groups. Scholars who were not executed were often subjected to heavy fines or the confiscation of their libraries, which contained the scrolls necessary for the preservation of ancestral lore. This intellectual vacuum led to a period known as the generation of persecution, where the lack of centralized leadership resulted in divergent local customs and legal rulings. The impact of this loss extended to the social welfare of the province, as the sages had also functioned as the administrators of communal charities and the supervisors of weights and measures in the marketplaces. With their removal, the traditional Judean social safety net collapsed, leaving the remaining population more vulnerable to Roman economic exploitation. The Hadrianic persecutions thus functioned as a form of cultural decapitation, aiming to replace the authority of the Torah scholar with the absolute jurisdiction of the Roman magistrate. While the military had cleared the land, the persecution of the sages was intended to clear the collective memory of the survivors, ensuring that no future uprising could be galvanized by the legal or messianic teachings of an indigenous intellectual elite. The survival of a small core of students in the northern districts remained the only barrier against the total dissolution of Judean civil and religious law in the wake of the 135 AD catastrophe. The material record of the Bar Kokhba War's conclusion is most legibly preserved within the arid microclimates of the Judean desert caves, which functioned as the final repositories for the personal and administrative property of the Judean refugee class. Archaeological investigations conducted by Yigil Yadin in the early 1960s at the Cave of Letters in Nahal Hever uncovered a stratified assemblage of artifacts that provide a precise forensic profile of the population's final months. Unlike the communal military caches found in the highlands, these desert assemblages are characterized by domestic intimacy and the portable wealth of families. Among the most significant finds are sets of bronze vessels, including paterae and jugs, which show evidence of having their pagan Roman iconography, specifically images of deities, and sacrificial scenes deliberately effaced with chisels. This selective defacement demonstrates the continued adherence to aniconic religious standards, even under the extreme pressures of a terminal siege. The presence of organic materials, preserved by the lack of humidity, allows for a detailed analysis of 2nd century Judean textile technology and dress. Recovered items include woolen tunics with clavi-vertical decorative stripes and complex hairnets, indicating that the refugees represented a broad social spectrum, including the affluent urban elite. Of particular historical weight is the discovery of large iron keys, some measuring over 15 centimeters in length, which were carried into the desert by families fleeing their homes in the Hebron Hills and the coastal plain. In Roman property law, the possession of the key served as the legal symbol of ownership. Their presence in the caves suggests an expectation of return and a refusal to acknowledge the imperial decree of confiscation. Furthermore, the recovery of hundreds of leather sandals, ranging from adult sizes to those belonging to small children, provides a grim demographic index of the non-combatant presence within these high-altitude death traps. The epigraphic evidence from these sites, most notably the Babatha archive, consists of a bundle of 35 papyri found in a leather purse. These documents, written in Nabatean, Aramaic, and Greek, detail complex litigations over water rights, marriage contracts, and property guardianships. The archive reveals the sophisticated legal literacy of the Judean population, which utilized various Mediterranean legal traditions to secure family assets up until the moment of flight. These records also specify the exact dates and locations of Roman administrative actions, providing a chronological anchor for the war's final stages. Additionally, the discovery of specialized medical instruments and cosmetic palettes indicates that the refugees attempted to maintain standard communal life and hygiene within the confines of the limestone caverns. The final advance of the Roman military is marked by the presence of plumetae lead-weighted darts and slingshots found at the entrances of the caves, often alongside the remains of those who perished from dehydration. The strategic placement of Roman siege camps on the cliffs above these sites ensured that no one could leave to forage or collect water from the wadis below. The abandonment of these high-value items, archives, metalwares, and sacred texts confirms that the end was abrupt and absolute. These archaeological witnesses provide a counter-narrative to the official Roman triumphal inscriptions, documenting the systematic liquidation of a society through its most mundane and personal possessions. The material remains of the desert hideouts stand as the terminal evidence of the physical erasure of the Judean presence in the southern Levant, capturing the exact point where a living culture was transformed into an archaeological record. The stabilization of the newly renamed province of Syria Palestina was predicated on a fundamental shift from a secondary occupation to a first-class military district. Prior to 135 AD, the region was governed by a single legion, but the post-war order mandated a permanent doubling of the garrison strength. This new military architecture was anchored by the presence of two consular-ranked legions, the Legio Def Fretensis, which remained headquartered in the redesigned colony of Aelia Capitolina, and the Legio Sixth Ferrata, which was permanently stationed at a strategic base in the Jezreel Valley known as Capricornia, later renamed Legio. This dual legion deployment, supported by dozens of auxiliary units, ensured that every major topographical zone of the province was under direct, immediate surveillance by professional Roman heavy infantry. To support this massive concentration of troops, the imperial administration constructed a network of fortified mansiones and mutationes along the primary trade routes, effectively transforming the civil landscape into a logistical extension of the Roman military machine. Administrative authority was further consolidated through the systematic reorganization of the rural interior into a series of Roman civitates. This process involved the legal reclassification of vast agricultural territories into municipal units governed by Hellenized or Romanized city councils. New urban centers such as Eleutheropolis and Maximianopolis were granted civic charters and assigned large territoria the surrounding rural lands that were previously governed by indigenous Judean village elders. These civitates functioned as the primary tax collection nodes for the imperial fiscus, utilizing the census to record every parcel of arable land and every productive head of livestock. The Roman government also incentivized the relocation of veterans through the Missio Honesta, granting them land grants in the hills of the southern Levant. These veteran colonies served as a reliable, loyalist demographic layer that diluted the remaining indigenous presence and provided a ready-made reserve force in the event of local unrest. The judicial landscape was likewise standardized to conform to the Codex Hadrianus. The provincial governor, holding the title of Legatus Augusti Pro Praetori, exercised supreme jurisdictional authority, conducting regular conventus or circuit courts in the major cities, to ensure that Roman legal procedures replaced all vestiges of local autonomous law. This judicial centralization extended to the regulation of marketplaces, where Roman officials, the agoranomoi, supervised the standardization of weights and measures based on the Attic and Roman systems. Public life in these new civitates revolved around the gymnasium and the theater, architectural hallmarks that signaled the province's full integration into the Hellenistic cultural sphere. By 140 AD, the province operated as a rigid hierarchy, where the Roman military served as the ultimate guarantor of order, and the newly established city-states functioned as the engines of Romanization. This new order effectively institutionalized the results of the 135 AD expulsion, creating a political and social framework that prioritized imperial stability and cultural homogeneity over the ancestral rights of the land's previous inhabitants. The demographic vacuum created by the mass expulsion and enslavement of the Judean rural population in 135 AD triggered a systemic collapse of the regional agricultural economy, which had been predicated on labor-intensive terrace engineering. In the high-altitude topography of the Judean hills, the soil is naturally thin and prone to rapid hydraulic erosion. Centuries of indigenous labor had countered this through the construction of dry stone retaining walls that leveled the slopes into productive horizontal strips. This artificial landscape required constant seasonal maintenance to clear silt from drainage channels and to repair the masonry damaged by winter rains. With the removal of the specialized labor force during the final Roman Vastatio, the maintenance cycle was permanently severed. The absence of the agricoli meant that a single season of heavy precipitation could breach a neglected wall, initiating a cascade effect where the failure of an upper terrace wall would release a torrent of debris that obliterated the tiers below it. This structural decay led to the rapid loss of the paleosol, the ancient, fertile topsoil that had been painstakingly preserved within the terrace beds. Once the retaining walls collapsed, the limestone bedrock was exposed, rendering vast tracts of the Central Highlands uncultivable for the new Roman colony. The economic impact was immediate, as the production of high-quality olive oil and wine, the primary exports of the region, plummeted. Unlike the grain-rich plains of Egypt or North Africa, the Judean economy was built on arboreal culture, which requires decades of stability to reach profitability. The Roman policy of uprooting groves during the war, combined with the subsequent loss of the terrace infrastructure, meant that the capital investment required to restart these industries was beyond the means of most veteran settlers. Consequently, the imperial fiscus saw a sharp decline in tributum from the upland districts, forcing the provincial administration to rely more heavily on the maritime trade of the coastal civitates. The collapse also extended to the sophisticated water harvesting systems that complemented the terraces. The Judean hills were serviced by a network of hand-carved cisterns and subterranean qanats that captured runoff for irrigation. These systems required annual desilting to prevent the blockage of the narrow feed tunnels. Without the coordinated effort of the village communes, these reservoirs became clogged with sediment or developed structural cracks that drained the stored water into the porous karst bedrock. This localized desertification made the upland environment hostile to the intensive settlement patterns of the previous century. The Roman military attempt to compensate by building larger, centralized aqueducts for the new cities, like Aelia Capitolina, did not restore the decentralized rural economy. Instead, it created islands of Roman urbanism surrounded by a derelict and unproductive hinterland. Furthermore, the loss of the terrace system altered the local microclimate and biodiversity, as the moisture-retaining capacity of the hills was diminished. The secondary growth of scrubland and thorns replaced the organized cultivation of the 7 species, leading to a transition from a sedentary agricultural economy to a low-intensity pastoralist model. The few remaining inhabitants were forced to pivot to sheep and goat herding, which further contributed to the degradation of the landscape through overgrazing and the prevention of forest regeneration. By the middle of the 2nd century, the Judean heartland, which had once been a model of Mediterranean terrace efficiency, had become a fractured landscape of ruins and erosion. The strategic relocation of the Sanhedrin to the Galilee following the 135 AD catastrophe initiated a structural metamorphosis of Judean governance, shifting it from a territorial sovereignty to a portable, text-based authority. With the southern heartland officially designated as a prohibited zone, the intellectual elite established a new administrative seat at Usha, followed by subsequent transfers to Shepharam, Beth Shearim, and Sepphoris. This northern migration was not merely a flight of refugees, but a systematic transplanting of the judicial and legislative apparatus of the Judean people into a region that had avoided the total scorched earth devastation of the southern hills. In this new context, the Patriarchate, or Nasi, evolved into a Roman-recognized office that mediated between the imperial government and the surviving communities. This diplomatic status allowed the Galilee to function as a semi-autonomous cultural enclave, where the codification of the oral law could proceed under the relative protection of Roman provincial stability. The intellectual life of the Galilee focused on the urgent task of standardizing legal rulings to prevent the fragmentation of the diaspora. The Sanhedrin at Usha enacted a series of emergency ordinances, known as the Takanat Usha, which addressed the social and economic crises of the post-war era. These laws regulated the redemption of captives, the support of orphans, and the limitations on charitable giving to prevent the total liquidation of family assets. By establishing these civil codes, the sages ensured that the dispersed population remained tethered to a singular legal framework, regardless of their geographic location. This period also saw the rise of the Tannanim, the repeaters of the tradition, who utilized mnemonic devices to memorize the vast corpus of legal debates that had previously been tied to the temple's sacrificial calendar. The Galilee's environment, characterized by prosperous agricultural towns like Tiberias, provided the necessary economic surplus to support these scholars and their burgeoning academies. Architecturally, the shift was marked by the emergence of the Galilean synagogue as the new communal and judicial center. Unlike the temple-oriented structures of the past, these buildings were designed as halls for the public reading of the Torah and the adjudication of civil disputes by local councils. Archaeological remains at sites like Capernaum and Chorazin reveal a synthesis of Judean functionalism and Roman decorative styles, such as stone carvings of menorahs alongside Hellenistic geometric patterns. This architectural hybridity reflected the pragmatic reality of the era. The Judean identity was being preserved through adaptation rather than isolation. The Sanhedrin's presence in the north also facilitated the standardization of the Hebrew calendar, a vital logistical tool that ensured all communities observed the festival simultaneously, thereby maintaining a unified national rhythm despite the physical absence of Jerusalem. The ultimate achievement of this Galilean period was the redaction of the Mishnah under Rabbi Judah the Prince at the end of the 2nd century. This monumental project served as the definitive constitution for a people without a state, organizing centuries of legal discourse into 6 thematic orders. By recording these laws in a highly structured, concise Hebrew, the Galilean sages created a resilient cultural core that could withstand the pressures of living under Roman law. The Galilee thus became the crucible for a new form of civilization, where the sovereignty of the law replaced the sovereignty of the land. This transition ensured that while the Judean province had been renamed and its capital rebuilt as a pagan colony, the internal identity of its people remained intact, anchored by a tradition that had successfully crossed the threshold of the 135 AD destruction. The divergent trajectories of Romanization in Gaul and the southern Levant provide a definitive study in the limits of imperial cultural integration. In the western provinces, the Roman policy of Interpretatio Romana successfully synthesized local Celtic deities with the Roman pantheon, creating a hybrid Gallo-Roman civilization. This assimilation was facilitated by the Gallic aristocracy's rapid adoption of Latin as the language of administration and prestige, which gradually supplanted the indigenous dialects in the public record. By the middle of the 2nd century, the Gallic tribal elites had transitioned from autonomous chieftains to Roman senators, their identity increasingly defined by the cursus honorum and the ownership of villas that mirrored Italian architectural models. The physical evidence of this synthesis is found in the scripts and epigraphy of the region, where the Latin alphabet was utilized to record a culture that increasingly viewed its pre-conquest history as a barbaric prelude to Roman civility. In contrast, the Judeo-Roman experience, post-135 AD, was characterized by a deliberate and systematic rejection of this synthesis. While the Gauls utilized Roman structures to enhance their social standing, the Judean survivors in the Galilee and the diaspora maintained a linguistic and legal barrier against the imperial center. The persistence of the Hebrew and Aramaic scripts for legal and religious documentation served as a diagnostic marker of this non-assimilation. While the Gauls participated in the imperial cult and the Pax Deorum, the Judean leadership codified the Mishnah, a document that reinforced a distinct set of dietary, civil, and ritual laws specifically designed to prevent the blurring of communal boundaries. This textual homeland functioned as a substitute for the lost territorial sovereignty, creating a portable identity that remained resistant to the gravitational pull of the Hellenistic gymnasium and theater. Furthermore, the Roman approach to land tenure differed significantly between the two regions. In Gaul, the empire integrated local landholding patterns into the Roman census, allowing for a continuity of the elite. In Judea, the mass expropriation of land and the conversion of the heartland into ager publicus meant that the indigenous survivors were denied the material basis for the villa-based Romanization seen in the West. This forced the Judean identity to become more decentralized and urbanized in its northern enclaves, relying on the synagogue, rather than the Roman Forum, as the primary site of communal organization. The Roman military also maintained a higher density of occupation in Syria-Palestina than in most Gallic districts, further institutionalizing the relationship as one of permanent occupation rather than integrated provincialism. The resulting divergence created two distinct types of Roman subjects: the assimilated Gallo-Roman, whose ancestral heritage was absorbed into the broader imperial identity, and the persistent Judean, whose identity was refined through the very process of resisting Roman cultural norms. This friction ensured that while the Gauls became the ancestors of a Latinized Europe, the Judeans remained a distinct and cohesive international community defined by a legal and spiritual code that the Roman state could neither ignore nor assimilate. This comparison reveals that Roman imperial power, while absolute in its military capacity, encountered a unique boundary in the Levant, where the resilience of a text-based, monotheistic tradition proved more durable than the physical structures of the Mediterranean state. The conclusion of the Bar Kokhba War in 135 AD functioned as the definitive terminal point for the political structures of the Iron Age Levant, effectively closing the era of indigenous monarchies and tribal principalities. Prior to this conflict, the Roman East still maintained vestigial connections to ancient local dynasties and traditional territorial boundaries. However, the total suppression of the Judean state signaled a transition toward a purely administrative imperial geography where the specific national aspirations of small ethnic groups were subordinated to the global requirements of the Pax Romana. This shift was not merely a military outcome, but a geopolitical reset that transformed the southern Levant from a semi-autonomous region into a standardized provincial zone. The removal of the last Judean executive authority meant that for the next 18 centuries, the political destiny of the land would be dictated by distant imperial capitals, Rome, Constantinople, Baghdad, and Istanbul, rather than local councils. This period also inaugurated the historical condition of the galut, or permanent exile, which redefined the Judean existence as a global rather than a local phenomenon. The loss of the territorial center necessitated the evolution of a decentralized communal structure that could function across multiple jurisdictions without a physical capital. The Roman legal classification of the survivors as peregrini deditici foreigners who had surrendered formalized this lack of a homeland, stripping them of the right to petition the emperor as a sovereign nation. Consequently, the Judean leadership shifted its focus from the recovery of the land to the preservation of the people through the rigorous standardization of the Talmudic legal system. This transition turned the diaspora into a permanent social reality, creating a network of self-governing communities linked by a shared text rather than a shared government. The economic and demographic void left in the Judean highlands was filled by the rise of a pagan Hellenistic urban class that was disconnected from the historical memory of the site. This created a profound cultural rift where the physical landscape of the Levant and the collective memory of its largest indigenous group were no longer aligned. The Roman military success in 135 AD proved that a sophisticated imperial machine could effectively deterritorialize a nation, maintaining its control through the total erasure of the previous political geography. This model of provincial pacification became a blueprint for later imperial responses to nationalist uprisings, emphasizing the total destruction of the leadership and the renaming of the territory to prevent the resurgence of local identity. Ultimately, the legacy of 135 AD was the birth of a unique form of historical consciousness defined by the yearning for restoration in the face of absolute political powerlessness. The era of the ancient kingdoms was replaced by a long-term theological and legal engagement with the concept of exile, shaping the internal dynamics of Judean life until the modern era. The Hadrianic victory did not destroy the Judean identity, but it did succeed in detaching it from the levers of state power, ensuring that the history of the southern Levant would be written by its conquerors while its original inhabitants preserved their legacy in the margins of foreign law. This rupture established the demographic and political parameters of the Mediterranean world for the next 2 millennia. The transition of the Judean heartland into a silent landscape of ruins and Roman civic monuments by the late 2nd century marked the final fossilization of the ancient world's most persistent resistance movement. This era represented the conclusion of the material Judean presence in the southern highlands, as the daily reality of a rural, agrarian society was systematically replaced by the archaeological Dark Age of the post-war period. The primary historical witness to this shift is the physical transformation of the province's topography, where the rubble of the Bar Kokhba hideouts was gradually covered by the expanding road networks of the Antonine dynasty. This layer of destruction became a permanent stratigraphic marker, separating the era of indigenous sovereignty from the long centuries of Byzantine and Islamic administration that followed. The Roman victory did not merely change the political leadership, it altered the very nature of how the region's history was recorded, moving it from the public sphere of coins and monuments to the private, internal domain of the rabbinic academies. The preservation of this culture was subsequently channeled through the medium of the oral Torah, a logistical adaptation that allowed the Judean legal and social framework to survive the total loss of its physical infrastructure. In the absence of a central court or a functioning capital, the text became the primary instrument of national cohesion, serving as a portable constitution that could be replicated in any geographic context. This intellectual pivot ensured that the laws of land tenure, agricultural tithing, and ritual purity were maintained in a theoretical state, even as the actual lands were occupied by Roman veterans and Hellenized settlers. The survival of these traditions in the Galilee and the diaspora created a unique historical anomaly, a nation that continued to function as a legal and social unit without the traditional requirements of territory, military, or central government. Economically, the region was integrated into the broader Mediterranean market, with the new Roman civitates focusing on the export of grain and textiles to the imperial centers. The specialized mountain economy of the previous centuries, based on the coordinated maintenance of the southern terraces, became a historical memory as the new inhabitants preferred the low-risk pastoralism of the plains. This shift resulted in a permanent change in the region's settlement patterns, as the high-density village life of the Second Temple period was replaced by a more sparse, urban-centric model. The Roman military presence remained the dominant feature of the landscape, with the Legio Exvertensis and the Legio Sixth Ferrata serving as the ultimate arbiters of provincial life, ensuring that the political and religious exclusions of the Hadrianic era were strictly maintained. Ultimately, the transformation of 135 AD established the blueprint for the medieval and modern Levant, characterized by a complex layering of cultures, where the original inhabitants existed as a distinct, yet landless, minority. The Judean world did not disappear. It was fundamentally reconfigured into a civilization of memory, where the physical remains of the past served as the catalyst for a sophisticated intellectual future. The conclusion of the Bar Kokhba War thus represents one of the most significant demographic and cultural pivots in Western history, marking the point where a territorial nation-state was forcibly converted into a global, text-based community. This legacy remains the defining feature of the region's historical trajectory, illustrating the power of a centralized empire to reshape the world and the capacity of a resilient culture to survive that reshaping through the preservation of its laws and history.